Switch the scene. There we are.
All right. Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to the Interchain Lab, Episode 5. Today, we're going to be talking about governance and incentives. I'm Robo, and joined today by Tog and Water Spinner, as usual.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
And then today, we've got quite a few special guests here with us. We've got Hathor from Hathor Nodes, and I'm just now realizing that you're probably not unmuted. 1 second.
Our bi-weekly struggle of unmuting people continues.
We have Hathor here. Are you able to unmute yourself, Hathor? Doesn't look like it.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Ah, there you are.
Yeah.
I'm free now. I can speak.
We also have Omar from Chaos Labs here with us. And Omar, are you able to unmute yourself?
Ah.
No permissions. Got it. 1 second here.
How
How about now?
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet everyone. And Omar from Chaos Labs.
And we also have Johnny Wyles here with us. I just allowed you to unmute yourself as well, Johnny.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you,
Yep.
Excellent. So,
And last but not least, Myles from Reverie is here as well. Can we get a quick mic check, Myles? Okay, we'll double check in with Myles later. But today we are going to be talking about governance and incentives. One of the unique things about Osmosis is it has a very malleable incentive structure that's adjustable by governance. Basically, you can allocate exactly how many incentives you'd like to allocate to essentially any pool on Osmosis just by a simple parameter change proposal. We've had a number of these. It's obviously it's not super feasible to adjust every time there's a new pool you want to incentivize to just do it like asynchronously like that. So there have been a number of past incentives models that have created categories of sorts that sort of made it easier to allocate these past incentives. We started with, and I'm just realizing I don't have the proposal here. Johnny, do you remember what the first incentives proposal proposed by Unity Chaos was?
I would have to check, but I think it's probably proposal 2 or something like that.
Okay. And I mean, originally that was just allocating initial incentives to a couple of the major pools, if I remember right. Like
it was proposal 2, yes, and it was exactly that, allocating incentives directly to the very few pools that were incentivized at the time.
Yeah, I think it was something like it was AKT and obviously pool 1, Atom Osmo, but as the pools on Osmosis scaled up, and they did so very quickly, it became apparent that that method of incentivization wasn't going to be practical. So the Osmosis DAO, Osmosis Governance, implemented an initial categories model that allocated incentives essentially based on transaction volume, swap volume. And I know that one was that one had some issues, specifically related to wash trading, which is the practice of swapping assets back and forth, in order to inflate the value and kind of take advantage of that incentive system. So as time went on, things started to evolve to kind of fit that. And we ended up with the current incentives model that we have today. And that incentives model was largely driven by Johnny and a few other core governance contributors. Johnny, do you want to give us a quick rundown of how the current incentives system works?
Yeah, and I would like to just say that a lot of it was originally designed by Unity. This was probably the big thing that Unity did as the last thing for Osmosis. But what the current model does really is the original model had all pools competing equally for the same amount of share of incentives. What this category model did was make it so that the pools that were paired with stable coins and the pools that were paired with what Osmosis deemed to be the most strategically important assets got the lion's share of incentives. So they got around 80% of the incentives that were emitted every single day, leaving only the other 20% for smaller pools, which still included things such as the Osmo Stars and Juno and Evmos to compete for. What that meant was that no matter how pools competed, you'd always have the bulk of the incentives going to the most important pools on Osmosis that were generating the most volume.
Yeah, and I remember there being a debate at the time where we were giving quite a few incentives to pools with a base pair other than Osmo, like, Atom pools specifically. And those did have, and still do in some cases, a lot more volume than some of the relevant like Osmo pairs. Like the one that I know has been pretty popular lately is Umi. Umi Atom gets significant swap fees versus like Umi Osmo, even though Umi Osmo is deeper and more incentivized. But this kind of, would it be fair to say that this kind of encapsulated like a desire by the Osmosis community to favor Osmo base pairs versus other base pair assets?
Yeah, the Osmosis community definitely favoured Osmo pairs. There was a whole push to completely remove all non-Osmo pools from the incentive system by quite a few community members. And the compromise was that we'd restrict them to quite a small amount. And of course, there is a weighting system in place as well, so non-Osmo pools have to generate more revenue to just get the same level of incentives that revenue generation would get in an Osmo pool. So there's quite a few kind of other criteria that go on in the background to weight pools, depending on what the composition is.
Yeah, and so one thing that I'm kind of noticing, like as we're going on and more asset pairs, like more asset classes are being added, is we're starting to see, I think, assets that may arguably fall outside of some of the categories, like liquid staking pools and soon to be stable swap pools. Do you see any challenges starting to crop up in the incentives mechanism that we're using currently?
Yeah, so stable swap is coming soon, and there is a proposal on Commonwealth now to talk about that. Because of course, at the moment, the categories are mostly based on whether you're paired with Osmo, and whether you're paired not with Osmo. There isn't, that the amount of incentives that go to non-Osmo pools is very small. But obviously stable swap pools are going to be pools that don't involve Osmo because they're going to involve multiple dollar stablecoins. The weird ones are going to be things like Osmo Stosmo, which last I checked, that proposal is passing. Because although it's technically what we would say is in the minor category, they are both effectively the same asset that we're incentivizing there. So it may not belong in the minor Osmo pool. It might need a separate pool itself. And the other thing with this system, which is a bit unfortunate, is that we have the same amount of emissions every single day. So all we do is we kind of aim for unbounded liquidity. We just incentivize pools to attract more liquidity continually. That there's no kind of this is the set amount of liquidity that we're going to want in a pool to be optimal. And that's one of the major limitations of the current system.
Okay, and I think that's actually a pretty good transition, because we've got a new incentives system that's currently in the works, with Hathor nodes and Chaos Labs co-working on this. This is being funded, for those who don't know, we've got this new incentive system in the works that's been financed by Osmosis Grants. And we have Myles here from Reverie to kind of give a little background on that, and then we'll get Hathor and Chaos Labs up here to kind of talk about that. Myles, are you able to unmute?
Myles is having some technical difficulties right now, so maybe just give him one moment.
Yeah, sure.
If not, I could just jump in. Let me see.
While we're waiting, I did have a question about the liquid staked Osmo pool. Kind of curious to see like what your thoughts are, Johnny. If it doesn't belong in like the minor category per se, would that be something that we should be creating like a different category for, or or would it be considered like a stable pool almost?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to say, first of all, I'm not in favour of this pool being incentivised.
Yeah.
I think I've made that clear on Commonwealth that I don't think that we should be incentivising liquid staking when there's only really one liquid staking agent available. But it looks like it's going to be incentivised. And I think that if the community does decide to incentivise these, we should probably be setting a different category for all liquid staking that is what the Osmosis community is comfortable allocating to liquid staking in general, and effectively make a liquid staking category.
Should they be like a little bit more maybe risk off, or at least I feel like liquid staked assets are weird because in theory Osmosis should want to attract that liquidity, which is a good argument for everything except for potentially liquid staked Osmo, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's a bit of an odd one, isn't it? Because we obviously want the liquidity of other liquid staked assets, but we kind of don't want to take that risk on ourselves by being the place. Right. So it's kind of like, what would happen if there was a competing DEX that decided to incentivize liquid staked Osmo heavily? That would take it out of our hands, but we'd still, in that case, probably want the liquidity of the liquid staked Osmo to be on Osmosis. So yeah, I'm not sure whether they need heavily incentivizing or not, because on the one hand, you've got inherent APR that isn't visible in the pools, because half of the pool is always going to be earning that liquid staked return, but the other half isn't, and that needs to be compensated, and that's what, for example, Stride is compensating for with the Stride emissions.
Right. Yeah, and I will be interested to hear what Hathor has to say about liquid staked assets specifically as well. But let's go ahead and queue up Myles. Myles, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Sorry, I've had some speaker troubles there, but yeah. So I'm part of the grants team. with Reverie, and just want to give a little bit of background on kind of how this initiative came together and how we're thinking about it. So, I think since we started the grants program, we've seen, a couple areas where we think, putting some folks on together and putting a lot of dedicated attention towards a few areas could really move the needle for osmosis. And this is really the first example of one of those initiatives that we've started. So, the main motivations here is we were looking at a few data points. This goes back to conversations with Hathor and JJ from I think it was OsmoCon, but just from a cost standpoint, Osmosis was spending unsustainable amounts per day across a number of categories. But we thought, before the most recent, incentives cuts, it was around 250K Osmo per day to LPs. And second, we saw that in terms of capital efficiency, Osmosis had a lot of room to improve versus some of the other DEXs out there, such as Uniswap. So, the TVL to volume ratio was much higher. Basically, every dollar of TVL was doing much less volume than some other leading DEXs, which suggests that Osmosis is really overpaying for liquidity for the most part. And there are a few rare cases where Osmosis is underpaying because the incentives were not, getting to pools with high demand fast enough. So, I think between improving capital efficiency and cutting costs where we think there is, Osmosis is overpaying, where there's more liquidity, frankly, than there needs to be for the amount of trading activity there is. And then improving UX through getting incentives to pools where there is, traders are experiencing slippage because there's not enough liquidity. And so in the third component was really, if we can improve the governance process around the incentives adjustments to make it, allow for a more dynamic model to be put in place, then that would be kind of the cherry on top. So realize that, putting together a team to build a new incentives model that's dynamic and taking in a number of data points and really optimizing for a few parameters would address a lot of these big needs. So we wanted to put together, a small team that had, a kind of a range of expertise and skill sets to dedicate a few months on this, both in terms of, the research that kind of drives, what the model will be optimizing for, and actually the engineering development to develop the model itself. And so, yeah, I'm excited for Chaos and for Hathor to talk today. I think we found a great combo to lead this initiative. Really complementary skill sets. Hathor, there's very few folks I think in the Osmosis ecosystem that have understand the nuances of Osmosis and is deep in the data as Hathor is. And we've seen, from Chaos's side, the work that they've done for Aave, Maker, Uniswap is clearly one of the lead development shops in the space. And so, just want to make sure it's clear, like our goal here is to help, from the grants perspective, is to help really kind of identify the needs, design these initiatives, go find, really capable grantees who are going to perform the legwork and support, the effort throughout the process, whether it's governance or just getting them connected with the right people and making sure everything is going on track. So it's really up to the community, though, to decide if this is something that's actually going to be implemented. So, with that, I'll kind of turn it over to Chaos and to Hathor.
All right. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I can start us off with sort of like a high-level overview of what we're looking at right now. This is Hathor Nodes, local friendly validator. For the last year or so, Johnny and Unity have been running our incentives program, and a lot of that I think has been focused on bootstrapping liquidity, just because we're a newer, DEX at that point coming into the scene. Like, we need to establish ourselves. We needed to provide sufficient liquidity so that holders of these tokens are willing to take the risk of joining this new DEX and putting their liquidity here and just trusting us with their funds. We've had great success with that. right? We have some like very well-funded pools with very deep liquidity, and we've sort of become like the established DEX of the Cosmos ecosystem. We're certainly the largest one right now. With that being said, it's a good time to sort of shift towards not bootstrapping liquidity, but maintaining healthy liquidity levels. And so the idea here with the research that I'm doing is to kind of outline for the community, like, all right, here's a good idea of what healthy liquidity levels look like. So to define that, and you get to take a step back and think like a protocol, right? Osmosis, or a DeFi protocol. We have this DEX app. What is the point of this DEX? That people can trade their tokens, right? That you can make swaps. How do you measure the quality of that for our end users, right? People who trade on Osmosis, and that's the slippage they face. The deeper liquidity we have, the larger trades that you can make without facing significant slippage. So how do we define, what is significant slippage? I think we aim for like 1%. When you look at the front end, it marks for you, but 1% slippage is like, how do we define that? And then how do we look at swaps that occur on Osmosis to say, okay, this pool over here, like here's the size of swaps that it gets, here's the number of swaps that it gets. This is the level of liquidity it needs so that the vast majority of users don't face a large number of slippage. So the idea is to go find those numbers for each pool individually, which removes that labor of like creating categories and double checking, is this in the right category, is this in the wrong category? Like we can remove that, we can remove any concerns about is the category like appropriate, right? When you run into something like ST Osmo, like is that the right, like what category does that belong in? Like we don't have to worry about that. We're just worrying about, can our end users have a good experience using this platform so that they'll use it? And then once we've defined that healthy liquidity level, here's how much of these tokens we need in this LP, now we can move forward and say, okay, well, they might need some incentives to maintain that liquidity level. And part of that is saying, what else could you do with those tokens? So I use Atom Osmo as an example. You could just hold those tokens. You don't get a reward for holding the tokens. You could stake them separately, in which case you get the staking APR of each respective chain. And then the last thing you could do is you could LP it. In the future, there'll be other things you can do with your tokens. Put them up for lending, et cetera, et cetera. But for right now, that's the general concept. So you can look and say, okay, I could get 23% staking my Osmos. So if I'm going to LP my Osmos with Atom, I want a comparable APR, also accounting for impermanent loss, also accounting for swap fees, the superfluid staking benefits that you receive, et cetera, et cetera. You calculate those numbers and you say, all right, given the current swap fees that we receive and the target liquidity level that we're looking at, like how many Osmos does this need an incentive to reach that competitive like APR that investors are willing to LP in this pool at this like healthy liquidity level, as opposed to staking it or taking their tokens and LPing somewhere else. And that's I would say the general high level framework of how I'm trying to think about these incentives and think about the number of Osmos to give each pool for their daily incentives. And then the extra incentives can just go into the community pool to be used later, whether it's just funding something else altogether or to provide additional incentives in the long run when we reach our like Osmo supply. So I think that's a very high level explanation. You can take a pause here if there's any questions for clarification.
Well, just kind of digging down into this a little bit, the fact that this is going pool by pool is pretty interesting to me. I know that Osmosis has over 800 pools, but obviously a lot of those are like dust pools, for example, and not really useful for this analysis, I'm sure. Do you look at those pools as well, or is there some way that you filter out the like smaller, non-essential pools?
So primarily the analysis is focused on currently incentivized pools with certificate incentives. Amongst that, I think it can be expanded. I just don't want to enter in gray areas of like, I don't want to make an incentives program that tells the community you should incentivize this pool or don't incentivize this pool, right? That's still something the community should have this discussion to make for themselves. So it's like useful to look at some of those pools. Some of those dust pools primarily just host arbitrage transactions, and arbitrage transactions for the most part are very small in size, so they don't need deep liquidity. Others have literally zero volume, right? And there isn't a need for them because nobody's using them. To answer some questions in here, White Marlin, this is going to ship. I'm going to say, so phase one is putting a proposal up for the community to discuss and hash out some questions that should be left to the community so we can discuss them more later on. Status on this is things are going pretty well. I expect to have that proposal up, I want to say mid-early January. I want to dot my I's and cross my T's on everything so that way it's in as good a format for just like straight to the meat discussion as possible. The status overall is pretty good. Is there another question? Have attacks been simulated? I am working on trying to think of the best way to simulate like wash trading and other. I assume by attacks you mean incentive manipulation. Making incentives like this, like the way someone would rig this would require them to own to be able to profitably rig this, you would have to own a significant portion of the shares in that LP, and then also have a large enough amount of funds to make a large volume of large swaps to attempt to manipulate the distribution of swaps to then draw more incentives to your pool. So I got to work on, I want to make like a formulaic programmatic way of doing that simulation to say like, are there breakpoints where it's profitable? I just need to like sit down and think about like what the best way to like lay that out is. But in a high level theory, like you'd have to be a black hat. Yes, well, I think white hats, right? Want some friendly people, to simulate attacks, hopefully. So I need to do a little bit more thinking about how I want to design the simulations for attacks. But I know the gist of what it would take to attempt wash trading it. So I have a general high level idea of what sort of profitable breakpoints and areas to be looking out for. And once phase one is done, should the community approve this general incentives model, I'm going to be like directly monitoring this for a couple of months before we get into like a working group that manages it. And I'm going to hopefully be able to put out like some kind of basic tool with some work with the folks at Chaos Labs and their engineering expertise to keep an eye out for any profitable wash trading zones where somebody could manipulate large amounts could run a large volume of large swaps and eat the slippage and still profit from manipulating pool incentives.
So just to clarify, this would kind of maintain the existing structure where we signal, we being Osmosis, the DAO, the governance, we signal what pools we'd like to see involved in the incentives mechanism, and then that would get rotated in and kind of be like, subject to that moving forward.
Correct. There can be, I don't want to say edge case, there can be situations where a pool swap fees are so large that the incentives map would come out and say, you don't need to give incentives to this to maintain a healthy liquidity. That is possible. In the discussion, we can discuss like, should there be some minimal number of incentives in that case, or is the community okay with saying this pool is incentivized, like in the code, it's in the list of incentivized pools, but it receives 0 osmos. But the way this is formulated, it'll never add a pool to be incentivized. The community will have to vote on that.
Okay. And how would that adjust for like changes in market activity? Is this going to be? I guess the question I'm asking is are we going to stick with the weekly the weekly incentives proposal structure to allocate these?
So end goal, I kind of already have the format and code for this right now, is this goes up every day, it checks and it calculates what the healthy liquidity level would be by looking back, let's say 30 days hypothetically, of swap fees and swaps, et cetera, and says, hey, what's the healthy liquidity level? What's the number of osmos this needs in incentives? And you calculate that for all the pools. Then you can do a statistical test to compare what today's like target incentives are versus what the current incentives on chain is. And if it's significantly different, say, okay, let's make a proposal. So the goal would be get to the point where we don't have to do this once a week. We can maybe do it like once a month or something. But in more volatile market times, you might end up in a situation where you get proposals once a week, right? You're never gonna get more than once a week because it takes 5 days to go on chain anyway. So it would just be, I think, a little excessive to have incentive proposals more than that. Ideally, I think like once a month would be nice, or just not at all if we could hit some kind of perfect equilibrium. But the crypto market is fairly volatile, so I wouldn't have expectations for very rare incentive proposals, right? Because we need to constantly adapt to the market.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know one kind of big thing we were sort of chatting about related to this is how external incentives play into this, because this model is effectively targeting a specific amount, a specific liquidity necessary to minimize slippage, and that's taking Osmo incentives into account. How does that account for the extent to which external incentives are also trying to incentivize that same that same liquidity?
Right. Okay. So that's a good question. There's a couple of ways to go about that. One way to look at it is we could simply say, and this is something I want to put up for discussion with the community, which is why I'm just putting a couple of thoughts that I have out there, because I think the community should definitely have input on this. Is like, one thing we could do is we could just say, you give us external incentives, we'll keep matching it up to this certain amount, the way we do now, just to say like, oh, like we're getting non-Osmo tokens inside the DEX, that's nice. The other way, which is more in this framework, I think we could look at it, is we can actually go out and calculate using the same math, right, and say, okay, this LP needs $200 a day in incentives. Like, our incentives budget is actually stretched quite thin because we're, incentivizing these other pools. You, blockchain X, your community should give $200 a day in external incentives so that your LP has a healthy liquidity level and your users can get access to your tokens and go, use your tokens on your chain. So it kind of opens up this possibility to turn external incentives on their head and say, dear other blockchains, you need, strong liquidity, healthy liquidity somewhere for your token to be accessible. Like, here's what the cost of it is to Osmosis. Like, would you like to chip in for part of that cost or cover the entire thing? And that might not be as prominent an idea, these days, where we still have like 250,000 Osmos a day coming out to LPs. But definitely in a few years, after a couple of third things, I think that's sort of the direction I would like to go in. We'll see what the community thinks. Is just simply going to and bargaining with these blockchains and saying, you want healthy liquidity, on Osmosis, like, here's what you need to cover what's not covered by swap fees.
Yeah, that almost kind of seems like a public good to an extent. Is like, here's how much exactly you would need to incentivize to get the target liquidity rate. They don't have to go through that analysis. We've kind of done it for them, and that I'm sure. I'm not involved with like a lot of other teams, but I'm sure that the conversations that happen around externals are like, okay, well, is this worth it? Right? Are we,
Right.
How much should we do? What kind of liquidity is that going to give us? Here's what we're looking for. Is that even going to be worth it?
Right, exactly. And that's especially useful for like newer tokens that come out, and they usually have higher staking APRs to start because they don't have a high bonding rate, and they want to start an LP and have it be incentivized. And it'd be very good for us to be able to go and say like, hey, like, you have 300% staking APR right now. Like, for us to host a competitive like APR for you, especially when your pool is newer and we don't even know, we don't have a lot of reliable data on what your swap size looks like. Here's a good estimate. Like, you should come forward and like put down for this, so that way you can help build your own liquidity pool. And then as your APRs get lower, like, we can also like chip in and incentivize. There's a lot of room in bargaining for that, but I think the biggest thing is like there's just like more control for it, right? There's just more knowledge and information accessible, so we can all come to like the best decision for us. to Benny's question, why would other projects commit external incentives when the base model is structured so liquidity would grow without it? So the idea would be, I think that's why, one, like, you don't see too many external incentives, right? Because we build liquidity without other projects needing to commit. There was a time where there was a lot of external incentives coming on Osmosis. I don't know if Johnny remembers this, when we had to put the cap on how much of our incentives would go to externals because projects were just throwing them at us left and right. But the big thing is, like, think forward to, like, long term, right? Because Osmo is a fixed supply token. Like, in a thirding or two, we might not have enough incentives to keep healthy liquidity levels for all incentivized pools, right? So going to other projects and saying, hey, you want healthy liquidity, like, it's not in our budget, you need to chip in this much, or like, you need to chip in half and we'll cover half. Like, we'll have the ability to say and do that, right? Right now, we could simply do our external incentive matching like we do now if we want to, like, get other projects to commit external incentives. But in the long run, when there's less and less osmos to go around, we want to have a reliable and, like, clear and concise way of saying, you want, like, healthy liquidity on Osmosis that needs, $50 a day in incentives until you have more trading volume in your LP. Like, you're going to have to provide that because we don't have, the osmos for that. Which changes are the recent changes?
I think he's referring to the ones that have already been implemented, the governance ones. But this incentives mechanism, as I understand it, kind of turns all of that, like, makes all of that, I guess, obsolete, and we're kind of starting it over from scratch, right? So I do think that there's an important discussion to be had around externals and, like, the extent to which allocating Osmo incentives might dissuade externals from being committed. But I think there's a good, like, thinking long term about this is definitely something that we need to start doing, because it's not like, we're past the days of the 1300% APRs, right? It's things need to start getting replaced by, we need to start conserving these incentives, I would say.
Yeah, I think external matching should be used quite a lot more than it is right now. Maybe even to the point where we just automatically external match up to the levels that Hathor set. Because obviously you're going to have these teams that come in, like when we set the caps for external matching, that give huge external incentives, and we're not going to match massive external incentives. But in Hathor's scenario there, they've already paid everything, so there will be nothing that we would need to match to get it to that target incentivization.
Right. And I remember ultimately the end goal, right, isn't let's get lots of external incentives, though they are nice to have. The end goal is let's get enough volume on Osmosis so that swap fees by themselves incentivize people to LP into pools. And you can look at pools that aren't incentivized these days and see some of them have pretty good swap fee APRs and have, like, a non-zero amount of liquidity in them, right? And just getting it so that we can get to the point where, say, like, the Atom Osmo pool doesn't need any incentives because the swap fees are covering that, I think is more of what should be the long-term goal. Like, external incentives are nice and they can help along the way, but we really should want to get to the point where there's just enough trading volume on Osmosis, like, even in, like, a bear market, that we can hold healthy liquidity levels because it's in an investor's best interest to sit in this LP and collect swap fees as opposed to staking or just holding the token.
For sure, yeah. All the incentives should just be to bootstrap liquidity and volume and attention to a token to get it to that level where it is sustainable on the swap fees alone.
Yeah, and just to add quickly, like, I think that if external incentive matching was, focused on too much to the extent that having more external incentives means that we're also paying more Osmo incentives than we should be, then I think it kind of defeats the purpose, of giving incentives in the first place, and, like, being conservative about that. I think Will had a question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, guys. And I will say, just to add to this incentive matching, I'm from Regen Network, and we've been looking into that since the spring. It's been a very drawn out process because I guess other projects have come first. But we would like to see in the Regen ecosystem just a protocol level match. So that way it's not every 45 or 90 days. There's some kind of vote to match. Instead, it's something that's voted on to say, 10% of Regen's inflation goes to incentive matching or something like that. So I certainly agree that it shouldn't be Osmosis's responsibility to incentivize liquidity across the entire IBC space. I think chains need to be chipping in. But then to come around to my question, so I'm in the United States, and I know there's a lot of people in the crypto space that are but there's certainly a lot of enterprise clients in the same situation. Essentially, the whole DEX incentive design philosophy is basically a disaster from a tax perspective, because especially in a down market, because income can't be offset by capital losses. So even if your LP shares are going down in value, you still need to pay tax on the Osmo income that you're earning. And maybe this is a little far afield for this discussion, but certainly in my mind, a more ideal scenario would be something where capital gains. If I sell, it's also, I think there's something different psychologically about an appreciating capital asset as opposed to LP rewards, that when you're getting income, people are just naturally more likely to sell some of it. Obviously, a lot of people restake all of it, rebond all of it. But just to put kind of a very different idea into the circle here, what would it look like to have an architecture where effectively incentivization happens through appreciation and Osmo price as opposed to getting paid out a fee? I'll stop there.
That's an interesting point and great question. A price appreciation of the Osmo as opposed to receiving Osmo's incentive. I think it'd be like a tough challenge in itself to tackle. Like, how do we make appreciation of the Osmo the reward? Like, how do you, like, from a tokenomics perspective, put that in? It would almost be like the reverse of, like, could we burn Osmos as an incentive to, like, that aren't your Osmos to, like, increase the value of an Osmo? I'm not quite sure how you would go about doing that, but I think from a tax perspective, you're right that would be much friendlier. Also as an American, I agree that'd be much friendlier, and it would be great if we could find a good solution for implementing something like that, or just making it more accessible to the community. Some of the tools that exist for just tracking how much you've received in incentives each day and what they're worth, so that you can just sort of like put aside your tax liabilities and be mindful of that every year, especially for those enterprise level clients that are going through some strict regulations on these things. Connor,
and just to add really quick, I think that the onus really should be on the regulatory body, because it's kind of a weird situation, but there's nowhere in the tax code, I'm sure, right? I don't know this obviously for sure, but I'm sure there's nothing in the tax code that accounts for something like impermanent loss, where the redemption value of your LP share changes, like versus one asset versus the other. Who are we to say that that's not like a taxable event necessarily, right? Because if I hold X and it's worth 10 Osmo and 10 Atom, right, and then IL turns that into 11 Osmo and 9 Atom. I don't think that I'm fully convinced that the IRS at least wouldn't try to find a way to make that a taxable event. I just think the regulatory space is so unclear about stuff like this that we need to, we need to look there and try to make some meaningful change there as well.
That's fair. Definitely not agree there. Let me just touch base on Connor from Flipside's question. The current model development only factor in historic trading data. How would it change to externalities like staking APR factor in? Staking APRs are factored in. Big shout out for Chaos Labs, who will be speaking in a bit for helping me collect staking APR data. We are looking at staking APR of these tokens to help determine what the competitive APR we need to offer is. So that's part of it. We also are looking at historic trading data to get the swap fees and the distribution of the swaps. And so, on a side note, not just a big shout out to Chaos Labs for all their engineering work, which is really great, and some dashboards they're working on that they'll talk about in a bit, but definitely a big shout out to Flipside Crypto and Imperator for their APIs and databases to help make this data accessible in a way that just allows me to do this analysis and work. It's cool to see how all the different projects and builders on this community sort of build on each other and build things. And I hope to see just more and more projects and collaborations like this, where behind the scenes, something somebody else made helped build something bigger, because this would have been 100 times harder without Imperator and Flipside Crypto, even though they're not directly working on it. But that's just the nature of how things work sometimes in the technical development world. Okay, so with that being said, if there are no other questions directly for me, I do want to give the spotlight to Chaos Labs so they can talk about their engineering work and the dashboards and a lot of the other things that they're doing on their end to help make this possible and just maintainable for the community.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Perfect.
Hey everyone, Omar from Chaos Labs. I'm going to drop actually a tweet thread here in just a second that describes and summarizes some of the work that's been done until now. But first, just a few words about Chaos. So Chaos is a cloud platform basically that specializes in optimization and risk of DeFi protocols. We do that via simulations. The idea is the platform is robust and open. So with specific protocols, we build the models ourselves. But for example, in this engagement with Osmosis, we let anybody else bring in their own model to run it on the platform. And that's exactly how the engagement is structured here with Hathor. Most of our work is basically giving Hathor a robust, stable platform for him to deploy his model in production and make it such that it's easily extendable. So when he wants to make updates, or when the community wants to make updates to the models, or maybe differentiate between different sets of pools, or have special rules, all of this can happen very quickly and be streamlined and not be a bottleneck for governance or for just having the right schema for doing the liquidity incentive distribution. So that's more of our work on this project right now. And what I'll do is I'll drop here the Twitter thread that has basically screenshots and an update of all the work being done thus far. Would love any questions, but would also really love feedback on the platform and the screenshots there. It can happen, async or via Twitter, because ultimately the goal is to make this complex model and heavy research that Hathor is doing accessible, digestible, and transparent for the community. So if you guys have any feedback on that and how you'd like to see the data displayed, we'd be very thankful for it.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking through some of the screenshots right now. This is really cool. Is this going to live anywhere on the Osmosis website, maybe some kind of incentives.osmosis.zone subdomain or something along those lines?
Yeah, so it definitely can. Right now, the plan is to have it on Chaos Labs. We have a community section where we have just open access tools for communities and protocols like Uni, Chainlink, so on and so forth. But definitely, we can either link to it or have it also hosted on the Osmosis domain. There's no issue there.
I really like this from a user experience perspective. I think incentives are one area that like the broader community probably doesn't participate on as much as they'd either like to or as they should. And I think it's because there's some kind of like easily digestible thing like this is missing.
Yeah.
So I think this is really, really cool.
Yeah, I actually kind of agree because as somebody who is a visual learner, seeing the even if they are basic graphs and charts out of, Google Sheets, like I have observed with Johnny before, or when we can create really nicely detailed things like what you're showing here, Omar, I think that the better way to display data in an informative and accurate way, the more, informed decisions people can make just in general.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I agree with everything that you're saying, and I also think when we talk about apathy and governance across protocols, it's really one of the issues that like it's not necessarily that folks don't want to participate or voice an opinion. It's just that some of this stuff is it's complex and there's no way around it. But just because it's complex doesn't mean that with the right abstractions it can't be communicated well to the community. So like at Chaos, we don't think it's an excuse, just because something is based in research and math to only have it or only have a select few in the community access it or voice an opinion, and that's what we're trying to do. So this is again the first iteration, and we plan on iterating on it. So as soon as it goes live and folks start using it, you can reach out to us in any ways, if it's email or Twitter or Telegram, and we're just looking for that feedback. And again, I want to just also thank Hathor for all the hard work that he's doing. We're helping him with getting the data, but in the end, he's building the model and spending a lot of time thinking about all the different edge cases, the extreme volatility that we're currently experiencing in the market, potential adversarial actors coming into the pool and kind of gaming it like we've seen on other exchanges. So big shout out there, and his work is much appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, like, for instance, Hathor and Emperor Osmo, who's also in the chat, I see, they have done always a really great job at trying to present data and to quote something that I've said, convert crypto to normie. Just because it helps when we all can help each other boil it down to something that's approachable, because once it's approachable, then people can actually start learning and maybe even someday be so well versed that they can get in and dig in themselves.
So definitely, it's one step at a time, and hopefully this is the first step in doing that and enabling it for the Osmosis community.
And hey, it's just Myles again. Would you mind just sharing, or confirming these dashboards? Heather mentioned mid-January for a governance proposal. And do you think these dashboards will be available then? And would that be helpful for the community when deciding how to think about this proposal?
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of timelines and launching, we have like a previous post that really details everything. But just like to summarize it, the second that Hathor finishes the modeling and we go up for the proposal, all of the dashboards listed in the tweet thread below are going to be available with it. And then it's extremely important because as the community votes on this, the goal is to make this as realistic and tangible as possible. So they're going to be seeing all of the tools publicly available. They can interact with them and then really get an idea of what it is, what is the value prop that we can bring to the community.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, this is really, really cool. I do have a couple more questions, but they're a little bit more like into the future. So if anyone has any specific questions or wants to even get up on the mic and ask a question, just let us know in the chat before we move on, and I'm sure everyone here will be happy to take your questions.
I do have a hard stop in a few minutes, so if anyone has, thank you again for having me. It's been great, and just thanks again to everybody for coming in and listening. So if you have any particular for me questions, I could take those before I leave. That would be great.
Yeah. So really quickly, I just with concentrated liquidity coming arguably right around the same time as this is going to be going up for vote. How are we thinking about the changes to incentives that are going to need to be made when concentrated liquidity is implemented on Osmosis?
That's a good question. So think of this sort of almost like a midpoint to concentrated liquidity. Because with concentrated liquidity, you would need even less liquidity to have a healthy pool than what we're aiming for now, right? Because you have that tight price range, so you don't necessarily need as deep a pool to avoid slippage. So what you're going to see, and Sunny's discussed this before, like doing a gradual swap into concentrated liquidity, that we're not going to immediately switch everything into concentrated liquidity, is almost like a tapering of incentives towards their healthy liquidity levels. And then I imagine like a path off from that towards like the concentrated liquidity pool type, and then switching the incentives to be appropriate for whatever level of liquidity is required for concentrated liquidity. Because remember, like we can say, hey, we have $60 million in the Atom Osmo pool today, but let's say we only need 10 million in concentrated liquidity world. We don't want the other $56 million to get up and walk away. Like ideally, we'd like to taper it, have them go stake some Osmos, maybe have some like lending or margin come out and they go do that instead. So there's going to be, and that's something that I'm going to bring up when we do the discussions in January, is just sort of like the pacing of it so that LPers have other places to put their liquidity inside Osmosis, since we are a DeFi platform overall and not just like a DEX, right? So that's the big way that this interacts with concentrated liquidity, is it helps sort of bring incentive levels down to where they need to be for concentrated liquidity.
Do you think that would lead to like an overall reduction in incentives emissions just in general, having more liquidity concentrated?
Yes, I think so. If all goes well, concentrated liquidity levels should be lower than what we need now, right? That's the whole point, is increased capital efficiency, which is great long term for Osmosis, right? Like we don't want to focus on TVL. We want to focus on like healthy liquidity pools, and the less liquidity we need to have healthy liquidity pools and have people be able to come and use them, the better, right? We just want that efficiency. And so concentrated liquidity is almost like a next step. Almost like if this is V2 incentives, concentrated liquidity would almost be like V2.5, like when we do that shift to those pool types, and can then gradually reduce liquidity levels there. But the big thing I think is going to be the pacing. And I think that's going to be the biggest thing. So everyone here who's active in osmosis governance, definitely think about that. Because the big thing I think is going to be the pacing of how do we get from where we are now to what the efficient levels are and what the necessary levels are over the next year, let's say.
And kind of key to that also, just to close, is the current incentive system is going to basically account for that, right? So it's not going to be a situation where we're going to have to redo this thing all over again. That it's the incentives mechanism being developed now is going to be able to easily account for that change.
Yeah, it should be able to shift over with relative difficulty. Again, that's a big part of why we have Chaos Labs here. It's our engineering expertise to help out as well. It's like I built the model in a way where nothing about concentrated liquidity should break it. And, at worst, like one or two extra data points in terms of what the concentrated, like what the price range is, might have to be added and accounted to, but nothing about concentrated liquidity should break this. And that's sort of the way I was thinking about it when I made it. And then Chaos Labs, their engineering that's to be robust and flexible and extendable and every other word for it. It's well made so that when we have concentrated liquidity, it should be able to switch over without too much difficulty on our end.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? And remember, you can just click the open chat button next to Lounge if you can't find a chat for this, and I can even bring you up on the mic if you'd like to come up and chat.
Floor's open. The deafening silence is deafening.
I've bored them enough. I'll take my leave.
This has been great.
No,
this I
has
think
been great.
Yeah, I didn't know the extent to which like all of these pools were being accounted for, and really, really excited to see all of the UIs being developed by Chaos Labs associated with this. I'm you know, as you know, someone in the OSL, user experience is super important. And this is, I think, going to be a great way to like onboard new people into governance discussions and incentives discussions that weren't there before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really quickly before you go, Connor wants to know where the best places to ask more questions between now and the proposal, wherever. Where do you want to aggregate questions?
Yeah, a good way to aggregate questions would probably be ideal. In general, just as like a validator member of the community, like my DMs are always open if you're not a scammer. So feel free to DM me here or on Telegram. If you have difficulty finding me for some reason, the Twitter llama Emperor Osmo posts like Osmo is really good at finding me because he has my personal phone number. So you can always ask him. Like he will not let it go. If you ask him a question, he will find me and make sure that you get an answer to your question. I promise you that. Like he will call me right after you message him. Like, why didn't you answer this question? I'm
Oh
like,
my
I was
gosh.
busy coding. I'm sorry. Like, I'll get you the answer. So yeah, you know, just message me. I'll talk to the OGP because I think this might be a good thing for them to sort of figure out like a good coordination channel. So I might punt it to them. If not, just DM me, guys. You know, I'm a community member. You're a community member. Come find me. You know, let's be friends. And I'll
Yeah,
leave on that note.
thanks, Tyler. I was just going to say we'll be having we'll be setting up mini channels for each of the grants initiatives as part of reworking our grants page in this Discord, hopefully soon. So there will be kind of a sub chat area where for every grant, and I think obviously one for this one where you can ask lots of questions.
Yeah, I've just linked the new grants channel in the chat here. And basically how it's set up is it's a forum channel. And right now it's just got the general like main chat to ask the grants team questions about applications and things like that. But there will also be sub forums for each grantee. That way you can hop in and that'll be a good place to like, localize those conversations on a per grant basis.
Thank you so much, Connor, for saying that, because I personally also believe forum channels have been the godsend Discord has needed for a very long time.
Yeah. I want to give everyone one last opportunity for questions before we thank our guests for the amazing discussion that we had here today, and let them go back to building. Okay, it looks like everyone's good on the questions. So really, everyone, I just want to thank you for coming on. Really appreciate your time. This was extremely enlightening for me, especially. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. We are scheduled for another 2 weeks out, which is going to be the week before, that 25th date of the month. And then I believe we have another one technically scheduled on the 30th, but keep an eye out. We might not be doing that one. We'll let you know if we plan on having that one on the 30th. But otherwise, I just want to wish everyone, happy holidays. Stay warm if you're in a place that's cold right now. Thanks for coming along. Never be afraid to come in and ask big brain questions or suggest people to, drag along, because Robo, Water Spinner, and I always love hearing suggestions, and we are definitely not afraid to start bugging people to come on and give us their Giga Chad brain thoughts on things.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And we'll be here in Discord if you want to chat with us about any of this. I can get you contact information for any of the people that are here, any of our guests today. And just, shoot me a ping in general chat or in the trading dungeon, and I'll respond pretty quickly.
Just to let everyone know, we are also going to be uploading our past episodes to our YouTube, and this was our first episode live streamed to our community YouTube page that the OSL has put together. So we will make sure that all of the episodes that we do have recorded are up there, as well as this one, and moving forward. If you can't get into Discord for some odd reason, we will be live streaming them directly to YouTube, which is going to be great. Yes, check out the recordings channels for that.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.